Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we get into our next unit for our poetry class here, which I'm just going to click myself into. So a couple of things about the workshop that we've just finished up. Once we got the technical issue of people being able to create threads and attach files correctly, once we got that sorted out, I think it was relatively straightforward as far as how the technical part of the workshop goes, just as far as submitting your file, your poem as a file, and then being able to see what your group members have submitted, and then providing feedback. So really the issues that people ran into were just not following basic directions once we had the technical part in place, and then some kind of half-hearted effort as far as providing some useful feedback to people. So there's not much I can say about that other than it really, you really need to follow the directions pretty carefully. Obviously, when we did have that initial technical issue come up, I fixed it right away, and then I was able to email everybody in the class immediately, so that really shouldn't have presented a stumbling block. And then, of course, we had the lag time between when you're submitting, and even if it didn't work right away, and then you're being able to get some feedback or give feedback, because we have the two due dates working for each workshop. So in addition to a lot of people just not doing anything, which is strange to me, there was again just some people who didn't follow the directions carefully or read carefully, and then didn't seem to make much of an effort in terms of providing meaningful feedback about the craft of a poem. There was a lot of, I like this, I didn't like this, which, like I said, is a fine place to start, but you really don't want it to end there. You need to really provide some substantial feedback. And the thing about workshop is it's sort of like the golden rule. You treat others or provide to others the kind of feedback that you yourself would like to be getting. So obviously it feels good if someone says, I liked your poem, or it sounded good, or, maybe you hear that someone was confused, but if they don't provide any specifics or, particular kind of lines or address particular choices that you've made as a poet, whether those choices are working, not working, or they just had questions about that, if you don't get any of that substantial feedback, then you've kind of written a poem, you've submitted it to somebody or let them look at it, they've said, and then what do? You have nowhere to go as far as, a revision strategy. If you did want to sit down and revise this poem, you're really kind of left on your own again, which defeats the purpose of workshop. You want to get some feedback that if you were to sit back down with that poem and revise it, you'd actually be able to look at the feedback you've gotten and say, well, where would I start with this? So it doesn't mean that your workshop group members are responsible for writing a thesis about your poem, or that you need to take every bit of commentary and somehow work it all into your revision. But certainly you need something substantive to start with, right? To be able to move your poem into something that's more effective than the revision before it. Maybe it takes a bad poem and makes it slightly better. Maybe it takes a good poem and makes that slightly better. So it's really not about turning, gold from lead sort of a thing. It's often revision is a fairly small series of steps that we go through to finally get towards a poem that's really a lot more effective than where we started a few steps back. But again, all of that depends on getting some substantial feedback from people. So hopefully we'll keep that in mind for the next workshop, which happens to be Unit 8, so we have a few units before we get back to this. And what I've done is set up Workshop 2 that we'll get to in a few weeks, so that the groups are much bigger. So if we do have people that don't participate for whatever reason, or just whatever happens, you're still hopefully more likely to get a little bit more substantial feedback from a greater number of people. So remember that when you're providing feedback, you really do want to kind of quote from the poem that you're giving feedback on, almost like we would in a face-to-face example, where if we're all sitting around a table, we've all got a hard copy of that poem, and if somebody says they really liked this line or they found it confusing, then you would actually show the person, well, at line 3, you would say. And if you're not doing that, in our online version, then again, you're providing this feedback that is really, ironically, sometimes more harmful than good, because the person who gets that feedback, okay, the poem's confusing. Well, where is it confusing? Or in what way is the word choice confusing, because words can mean different things? Is there not enough concrete kind of specifics? You know, are you doing too much showing and not enough, or doing too much telling and not enough showing? Is it that kind of a thing? So just like you would face to face, you'd be able to point to, you know, line 3, stanza 2, this particular word. We want to duplicate that in the online environment as best we can by taking care to really, again, sort of like quote from and provide that feedback directly to the person. You're cutting and pasting maybe from the file that they've submitted into that text of your feedback. Even a good strategy is to go through stanza by stanza. In stanza 1, I appreciated how you started with this interesting metaphor. I was confused though, because the metaphor seems to switch here at line whatever, whatever. And that's not the only feedback you provide. That's just part of a much longer effort to, you know, respond to all of those elements of craft that we've been thinking about, whether it's sort of big, like what's this poem about, or some of the more minor but still meaningful stuff, like why capitalize, why not capitalize, or I wondered if the choice to make very short lines didn't really work counter to the idea that I was getting out of the poem, that kind of thing. And like I said, each of those examples is narrow in scope, and it's not a big thesis about the poem, but it's also not the only piece of feedback that you would provide to somebody in the workshop setting. So hopefully workshop 2, which again we get to in a couple of weeks, will provide people with a little bit more substantial feedback about their poems, and we'll be a little more used to the way that the whole discussion board system works, and submitting your poem as a file so that people have access to it and can print it if they want, so that you have a document copy of it, not just something that you've typed into Blackboard, all of those things, just kind of following directions. Okay, so we move into Unit 5, which is kind of back to thinking about elements of craft and how poems work and that sort of thing. So we'll be taking another look at metaphor, kind of one of those fundamental building blocks for poetry, saying that one thing is another. So it's related to things like simile and analogy and that sort of comparative aspect. In fact, metaphor is interesting and has an enormously long literary tradition, really back to the start of writing, in the sense that the effort of particularly artistic writing, the effort is often to make sense of the world. And so if you think about ways that we can do that, and ways that we even do that, you know, subconsciously, it's kind of how our minds operate sometimes, is that if we encounter something new, we often make the effort to think about it in terms of, or understand it in terms of something that's more familiar or something that we do understand. And so to make that connection or comparison is obviously fundamentally the act of metaphor. So it's no surprise that that device is, again, kind of central to art, and particularly to poetry, you know, writing. The other interesting component to metaphor to think about, and this has been theorized by a number of different poets and critics, is the degree to which art's job is to defamiliarize. In other words, things that we're so used to seeing, we become so habituated, even to beautiful things in the world, or things that we say we take for granted things because we see them every day, or they're just so easy to get to. Part of what art often tries to do is to kind of wake us up a little bit. And how that happens is often through the technique of metaphor, analogy, or simile, because what the poet asks of us, if he or she gives us a metaphor to think about, is, he or she asks us to think about that thing or see it in a way that comparatively maybe we hadn't before. In other words, we see an event or a landscape or a person or a something every single day of our lives, and we get so used to it, it's kind of beauty doesn't even touch us anymore. If a poet can write about that particular scene by making a comparison to, again, using metaphor, making that comparison to something that we hadn't necessarily associated with that event or person or place or whatever it is before, then we can sort of see that old thing new again. So metaphor works to defamiliarize us to things that are become familiar so we can appreciate them all over again. So again, metaphor has one of the deepest traditions in terms of art and literature that we can find, and is also one of the most kind of fundamental building blocks of art and poetry. So it's no wonder that we do spend a lot of time in our class thinking about very broad ideas of metaphor, even in terms of like the Eliot stuff we've covered. That's really a discussion of bringing pieces together, which ultimately leads us to metaphor, to this thing is this thing, or this thing is like this thing, if you're going to use simile. And so we return to it in this unit, as well as I believe in the next unit. We actually look more at speaker, which, as you'll see when you get to that unit, is just another component that's sort of related to metaphor, because obviously we have someone telling us the poem. So another one of those fundamental building blocks. Okay, so I'll leave you to it. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to be in touch.